Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. It's time to talk about realism today, and the reason for this is because whenever a change is made in War Thunder, one of the things that's always debated is the realistic part of it. Is it historically accurate? Is it realistic to make sense in the game? And it's usually used in a positive way or a negative way. The whole point of it is to try and get somebody riled up because they're either making the change for realism, therefore it's negative, or they're making change for realism and therefore it's positive, depending on who you're speaking to and what they get out of the game. Now, the way that I've seen realism is always it is a secondary factor. It is an important factor because War Thunder is supposed to be a realistic game, which means that it follows historical tenets, but also it means that it has to take a step by when it comes to stuff like certain gameplay elements or how fun the game actually feels. Now, there are plenty of things that have been added over the game over the last few years which are realistic, which are incredibly fun and enjoyable to use, and then there have been things that have been added into the game which aren't realistic and not very fun either. So for me, it's one of those things where it really depends, first of all, on the person you're speaking to in terms of the realistic part, and also, at the same time, it's one of those things which just depends on what is being implemented and does it actually make the gameplay more entertaining, and that unfortunately is a subjective thing. So, the people who put forward the idea that stuff has to be added because it's realistic, usually there has to be other factors involved to make it fun and to make it interesting to go for, and then also the other side of the faction, which doesn't want anything realistic and just wants everything focused when it comes to gameplay or stuff like that. There needs to be a little bit of leeway on that side of things too, otherwise it will lose the charm that it has compared to a lot of other games that exist, which, you know, are very unrealistic, and therefore it would lose ground in that setup. War Thunder actually balances out the two ideas pretty well. Not perfectly, because I think that's near enough impossible, but what they do is create, realistic models with shells, which, they used, historical setups, and all of that, and then the gameplay itself is the part where they go a little bit skew-whiff with it, and I think it's why the game is so successful and works so well together. So I thought in this video, what we would do is we would talk about a few different very realistic things that would pretty much kill the game, just to kind of give a outline of where realism sometimes goes too far. When you think about the missile changes, for example, that they added in, taking vehicles which already were not very powerful, like the AT-GEM carriers, and making them slightly worse wasn't exactly great, and then you have a bunch of other changes which were brought in, which were masked as realism, and because of that, people use that as a bat to smash them over the head, instead of thinking about the implications of the gameplay part of it. So the first one is pretty obvious. Not being able to repair damage, and also bailing out after getting hit once in ground, and I suppose a few times when it comes to naval. Imagine if it was whoever just shoot first, whoever penetrated first won, and also you weren't ever able to repair damage. So if your track got taken out, you would just be stuck there the whole game. If, let's say, your turret got taken out, you would obviously bail, but let's say your gun got taken out, well, what are you going to do? You're just going to sit there and you're basically a pillbox with a machine gun. It isn't really fun to think about. Or maybe even in naval, where let's say some of your turrets get taken out, and then what are you going to do? Well, I suppose you're just going to sit there and wonder what's going on. The repair system is inherently unrealistic, but if they removed it out of the game and instead made it more realistic, it would just be whoever has the lowest ping, whoever shot first at you, would just have an insane advantage. I always thought it would be interesting if they ran an event like that, just to kind of prove how insane it would be, because there would just be so many people who would leave it so quickly because of the fact they wouldn't really be able to do anything. There would even be instances where you would get a penetrating shot, which wouldn't really do any damage, but because you were penetrated, then you literally wouldn't be able to do. You know, your crew would just bail out because it was penetrated. The other part is crew being hit. Once they are, you know, even slightly damaged, they are out of action. So, you know, there's none of this unconscious thing or anything like that. You would just be done, which, once again, wouldn't be very fun. The spawning in and also running into mechanical failures randomly, that also wouldn't be very enjoyable. If you've read about Kursk, for example, the Battle of Kursk, which was one of the last large-scale, I suppose, aggressive offensive actions that the Germans did, the counterattack at Kursk, against, well, the USSR on the Eastern Front, they brought in a bunch of new technology, whether it was the Tiger, which had already been on the battlefield, the Panther, and of course, the Ferdinand. Or I suppose, was it the Elephant at that time? No, it was the Ferdinand. The Ferdinand was the first one. The Ferdinand was a vehicle which had a ton of mechanical issues, and to be honest, so did a lot of the other German ones, but so did a lot of the Allied stuff. There was many vehicles that had broken down, whether it was transmissions breaking, engines breaking, or even just, you know, turret drives not working, all these things which would just cause vehicles to have to be abandoned in order to get into another one and go ahead. This would happen so much. The Ferdinand, as a vehicle, was always seen as this problem child because it wasn't able to defend itself against infantry that was near it, and also, if there was even a slight incline trying to get it up a hill or something like that, the transmission and engine had to work so hard that they would end up just running themselves into the ground. So imagine if these things were actually in War Thunder, or imagine if you are flying a plane and, you know, randomly in the air, your gun malfunctions, or your engine just decides to not work, or maybe you spring a leak from your fuel or from your oil, and you have to return to base, or maybe you just can't and you just end up crashing. Stuff like that would be so annoying in the game. RNG stuff which negatively affects you is never fun in these types of games, and that would be one of those parts. And also, on top of that, having your vehicle built and also transported to the hangar. Imagine every time you researched a vehicle, right? Imagine every time you researched something like, I don't know, a M3 Lee. What you had to do is you had to sit there and you had to wait for the standard amount of time that it took to build an M3 Lee in the, you know, Second World War period. Now, there are some vehicles where I suppose it wouldn't be too bad, like something like a B-17, where they were building one pretty much every day, so you were able to get it off into, you know, the fight very quickly, even at just one specific plant. But something like a tank, or something like, you know, some of the earlier vehicles, which maybe some of them were even just a prototype and they took years to put together. Imagine having to wait like 3 years for something like that. Now think about like the Roanoke, right? So the Roanoke is a light cruiser for the Americans. It was laid down in 1945. It was launched in 1949, and it was launched in 1947, and then it was commissioned in 1949. So that vehicle, you would have to wait 4 years in order to play it once you've researched it. Which is just so funny to kind of think about. Another timing thing that would be funny would be having to reload ammunition after or before a battle. Imagine if in the hangar you had to tell your crew to load the ammunition into your plane, or load, you know, the ground stuff, like the ground shells, into the vehicle. And then what you had to do is change what you had inside of the vehicle. And instead, you had to unload all of those other shells and reload the other ones. Can you imagine how long it would take before you would even be able to go to the battlefield? It would just be so nuts at the end of the day to kind of see. It would suck if that was the case. And as we know, when it comes to many of these types of vehicles, they actually would need an assisted kind of reloader to be able to get these shells into the vehicle. Definitely wouldn't be very fun, and would make the gameplay experience incredibly annoying. And the last one is running out of fuel in naval or ground. Now, I know when in aircraft we do have a fuel indicator, but the amount of fuel that a lot of these vehicles carry does actually match up a little bit better compared to fuel that ground vehicles would carry or naval vehicles would carry in terms of how long the games are and how much you travel around. So I know people have asked for adding fuel into these things because, you know, of the fact that air has it, but that's never been a good reason for me. I just think about the idea of when wandering around in ground and you get hit in the fuel tanks, once again, your crew would bail. But let's say if they didn't bail, and instead you just drained all of your fuel out and you're just sat there once again without, you know, all of your systems. Your electric power would go down, you would have to hand crank everything, you would just be stuck not being able to move. Somebody would have to tow you to a capture point, which, if we're being realistic, wouldn't give you any ammo and also wouldn't give you any fuel either. So it just seems like an awful idea. But, you know, there will always be people advocating for these things. And luckily nowadays, if you want like the ultra-realistic experience, there are games out there which do provide that. They're not as sophisticated as War Thunder, they're not as big as War Thunder, but they are out there. And the reason why they're not as big is because it doesn't appeal to as many people as War Thunder does. Even though we do, you know, go after and do complain a lot about things in War Thunder, you can't really disagree that they've married the two ideas well together. The idea of fun gameplay and also realism. There's no other product on the market that has even come close to that, unless you may have a look at some kind of like RTSs which are around, but they're fundamentally different games. As always, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank GMG Smiley, CD Beans, Chieftain Mike, EMN3 Galaxy, Tulio Pontecorvo, Brendan Quinn, Carrion Crow, Gus Irenicus, Pyman, Wartinder, Teddy, Daniel Stanton, Martinez, B. Young, Ozzy Panzer, Alan Hacker, Liam Shear, Opium Prime, Lafouche, Sem, Aslan, Uncle Bean, and Derek R. for supporting the channel.